From the heartland of America, the gateway to the West. Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be, across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie, and welcome to the world's most listened to Coast AM. Good to be with you, and thanks for the privilege of broadcasting this wonderful program for you. Open lines at the half, and next hour, Paul Kimball, UFO cases in North America. And get ready for some of the things he's going to say. Well, here's some quick stories of the day. Even though this tape, purporting to be from Osama bin Laden, has not been authenticated yet, he is saying that Zacarias Moussari had no link to the 9/11-2001 attacks. Now this, according to the Al-Qaeda leader again, but like I said, this audio tape that surfaced on a website has not been authenticated. Who knows who it may be? It could be bin Laden. Bin Laden's alleged voice claims responsibilities to carry out the attacks, that they were given by him to 19 men, and that Moussari was not one of them. The new tape is propaganda, plain and simple, says a U.S. intelligence source. The official said the message is part of bin Laden's continuing effort to demonstrate that he's a relevant extremist leader who is knowledgeable of current events. The tape is not entirely unexpected. Leading up to the Moussari verdict, the government was monitoring jihadist websites in anticipation of a response to the jury's decision. A new Zogby poll apparently reveals that less than half of the American public trusts the official 9/11 story or believes the attacks were adequately investigated. The poll is the first scientific survey of Americans' belief in a 9/11 cover-up or the need to investigate possible U.S. government complicity. In a moment, we're going to be talking with some people about this from the 9/11 Truth Organization. That's a coalition of researchers, journalists, and victim family members working to expose and get answers to this situation. So that story is upcoming in just a moment. Now, don't panic on this one, because we are still going to hold our own here in our views that the bird flu will not become a pandemic. But according to the World Health Organization, they say a family of 8 people infected with the bird flu in Indonesia may have passed the disease among themselves rather than catching it from poultry. The agency did not immediately indicate whether it was going to raise its alert level, which remained at 3, where it's been for months. That means there is no very limited human-to-human transmission. They don't seem to be too concerned about that, but I wanted you to know about that story anyway. Another attack by an animal on a human. This in Orwell, Ohio. A 500-pound bear escaped from an animal breeder, entered a neighboring home, and attacked a woman. The victim was expected to survive. The bear was lured out of the house and shot to death by the breeder. But still, again, another attack by animals. The Egyptian authorities have given the go-ahead for the underwater exploration of what appears to be a Roman city submerged in the Mediterranean. Well, the old guy that we talk about all the time, Zahi Hawass, said in a statement that an excavation team that had found the ruins of the Roman city some 20 miles east of the Suez Canal on Egypt's north coast. The archaeologists had found buildings, bathrooms, ruins of a Roman fortress, ancient coins, bronze vases, and pieces of pottery that all date back to the Roman era. Egypt's Roman era, by the way, lasted from 30 BC to 337 AD. In Bucharest, Romania, more than 60 years after it was seized by communists, the Romanian government is to hand back one of the country's most popular tourist sites, the fabled Dracula Castle, to its former owner. The handover ceremony will take place Friday in the 14th century Castles Museum, deep within the fortress in Transylvania. The castle, worth an estimated $25 million, was once owned by the late Queen Marie and bequeathed to her daughter, Princess Elena, in 1938. It was confiscated by the communists in 1948 and fell into disrepair. Now, in a moment, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking with a member of the 9/11 Truth Organization about this quest here. Apparently, Americans would like to get more information. They want to get to the bottom of 9/11. We'll be back in a moment on that story on Coast to Coast AM. Mike Berger is the media coordinator for the 9/11 Truth Organization. Born and raised in New York, he earned a degree in sociology with a focus on human motivation. The 9/11 Truth Organization, as I mentioned, is a coalition of researchers, journalists, and family members working to expose and get answers to the hundreds of still unresolved questions concerning 9/11. Mike works to get to the truth of what went wrong and why we were so unprepared for the attacks. He's currently married, lives in St. Louis, my neck of the woods. Mike, I'm still in St. Louis. We should have invited you down to the cave for this interview. How are you?
Great. How are you, George?
Good. It's good to talk with you. This Zogby poll, which is estimating now that over 70 million American adults support a new 9/11 investigation, tells me that there's still a lot of unrest. After all these years, they cannot muster, those people who believe the true government position cannot even muster 50% of the people to believe the story. What does this tell you, Mike, in the organization 9/11 Truth?
Well, I think it's quite amazing, actually, if you think about the powerful machinery of the mainstream media, or as some people call them, the liberal media, in promoting the official propaganda of the government conspiracy story. If they can't muster, after 4.5 years, more than half the country supporting the official story, it would seem to me that it demonstrates that grassroots movements in this country are and can be effective. That we no longer rely on just the mainstream media for information, of the power of the internet and new technology to communicate and get research and evaluate evidence out to people. It works. It's working, and that I think it's a really a positive, optimistic sign for our future that we can reclaim the country effectively.
Do you believe there's going to be any activity, because your organization, 9/11 Truth, would like to get these politicians or candidates to really recognize, hey, this is a major issue here, let's get some answers, but is it going to go any further than where it is now, Mike?
Absolutely. I think this poll shows that the American people, I mean, again, those who are aware of, for example, the collapse of this third building, Building 7, happens to be almost the same proportion of people in the poll who don't trust the official story and want a new independent investigation. So I think the implications are that if you're a political candidate running in 2006, there's an enormous constituency here of people who are looking for change.
Mike, so important for you to tell us about your organization, because you are not conspiracy buffs. You are a coalition of some dedicated people. Tell me about the members of the 9/11 Truth Organization.
Sure. I mean, we're a grassroots organization made up of average people, of, in some cases, researchers, journalists, artists, scholars, average people who put together and publish research on the internet, put together events like our upcoming conference in Chicago, 9/11, Revealing the Truth, Reclaiming Our Future, and are involved in public education to raise awareness about the events of 9/11, but not only 9/11, because ultimately for us to be effective as in changing the direction our country is going, we have to find common ground with other people who also see that 9/11 has been the justification for so many unfavorable policies, illegal wars. Even just last week when they released the Flight 77 video at the Pentagon,
right.
Over and over you heard this as the justification that Americans needed to be reminded why we're in Iraq, why we're in this war, and why it's okay to have Americans under surveillance.
Mike, is your organization taking a stand on that issue itself, Flight 77, that some people say never hit the Pentagon? My question to those people, whether it did or did not, I do not know. Though I'd like to see the video, quite frankly, because what I've seen so far doesn't show me a plane hitting the Pentagon at all, so I have some doubts. But I want to know what happened to the plane, where it might be. Does your organization look into that?
Actually, George, our position is very similar to yours in that we support the Freedom of Information Act requests not just by Judicial Watch, but there was actually another person, a Mr. Bingham, who had filed multiple Freedom of Information Act requests. His were never acknowledged. It's interesting that the government chose to honor the Freedom of Information Act request of Judicial Watch, and yet they really didn't, because they only gave us those more ambiguous frames, as you said, which still don't prove their case. So for us, I mean, on another level, I see the Flight 77 issue as a distraction, because there are so many more salient and hard evidence of potential complicity, such as, you know, the collapse of Building 7 in New York, a third building not hit by a plane, collapsed at 5:20, and the media shows the towers coming down, the planes hitting the towers. But why won't they ever show this third building? I mean, which in any other state, such as, you know, Missouri, it'd be the tallest building in the state.
Oh, sure.
47-story building came down in 6.6 seconds in its own footprint, which is what's so odd about it. If you begin to look at how this building was built, it didn't have a support structure like in normal high-rise buildings that was symmetrical, because it stood over an electrical substation in Lower Manhattan. So for it to come straight down is quite odd. And then even eyewitnesses, such as New York Magazine reporter Mark Jacobson said, you know, I was down at Ground Zero, I was there, I saw the building come down, and a firefighter, you know, came up to me and he said, you know, that building's going to come down. Well, that's kind of strange, because no steel frame structure has ever collapsed from fire alone. And
you know, I've been wrestling with something, Mike, for a number of years now, and I'm almost at a point now where I'm pretty secure in what I think might have happened. And I'm going to say this for really the first time. I hinted about it when I had a roundtable discussion on 9/11 several months ago. I have been wrestling with the question of why is this so polarized? Why will we have slightly more than 50% of the people not believing the government's version, and then the rest of the people believing everything that they've been told? To a point where there's no middle ground here. I am beginning to believe that both people are correct. And what I think might have happened here is there's no doubt in my mind that the Osama bin Ladens and his group of cronies were part of this, and that he was smart enough to convince 19 people to commit suicide on these missions. However, and this is where I think the conspiracy people are accurate as well, I think there was another group involved that somehow got bin Laden involved, financed him, helped him in order to justify whatever's going on, whatever they're profiting on, and they got together as a conspiratorial group together and did what they did. So I think the two facets, the two factions are correct. They just haven't put it together yet. I think that's what happened. What's your take?
I mean, you know, it's quite possible, but once you start to dig into the details, it really becomes quite murky, because, for example, we now know that the hijackers were under continuous surveillance, and I don't use that word loosely. I mean continuous surveillance by both domestic and foreign intelligence agencies. You had Able Danger. You had FBI agents who, you know, sent their reports to headquarters, and those investigations were thwarted by the same few people who we know were then subsequently, within 1 year after 9/11, promoted. We had one cell living with an FBI informant. They had driver's licenses, telephones in their names. Some of them were even registered to vote. They trained at military air bases. So when you begin to look at that, it becomes quite puzzling how it is that we were unaware on the one hand, especially in light of, you know, whistleblower testimony like Robert Wright and Colleen Rowley, etc., saying, you know, we knew this was coming. We tried to really prevent this, and we were prevented from doing our job.
Well, which backs up my argument, Mike, that there were members within government who knew what were going on. There were members in government who wanted this to happen for their own personal reasons, and they go ahead and cut the deal with the bin Laden group to get this done with Al-Qaeda. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that somebody flew those planes into those two towers. Somebody was trying to hijack and successfully hijacked, and whether the Flight 93 over Pennsylvania was shot down or pulled down, who knows? I happen to think it was shot down. But the point is that somebody had to do that, and somebody had to be convinced to go on a suicidal mission. Whether just the pilot knew about it and his friends did not, who knows? But to me, your argument points out that mine might be correct in that there were two groups working together to get this thing done.
Well, we can take that a little further. I mean, on the one hand, we know that Osama was an asset of the CIA. We backed him, financed him, armed him. And to take what you're saying a little further, there's another possibility that is a little bit easier to understand, which is maybe the people who were trained or co-opted for this event, for this attack, for these hijackings, they didn't even have to know they were suicide hijackings. I mean, in essence, they may have been under the impression that they were going to make political demands. I mean, there may be other alternatives here. It gets a bit murky. It really depends on where the research leads.
If we as a group can take the position that a group got together with bin Laden and put this together, maybe bin Laden was approached by it, but they put this together, I think we can get the answers quicker.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think the entire issue surrounding this is that, again, going back to the poll, it demonstrates that the people who are aware of the evidence want really an independent investigation, either by Congress or an international body. But I think really it has to be a truly independent investigation. It can't be run by the same people in Congress. And I think that also touches back where you were going on how split the country is. Because if many people only see this as a polarized left-right dichotomy or Republican-Democrat, that it's always filtered through that lens, then effectively the game stays the same. It's kind of like a good cop, bad cop game. And yet what we're hoping is that, in light of these poll numbers, that candidates who are running for office in the 06 election cycle, that the American people will see that you also have an alternative, that there are people who reflect your values, who are running for office, who may not be from either one of those parties. Maybe they are, but it's what's in their platform that's important. What do they stand for? And if they reflect our values, it's incumbent on us to rise up and support them, because really it's the only way we're going to take back the country. If you don't like the way things are going, if you don't want to be surveyed, if you don't want to have your constitutional rights eroded. So I think we have a choice here.
Mike, this conference that's coming up first week of June, if you want to tell us a little bit about that, please.
Sure. The title of the conference is 9/11 Revealing the Truth, Reclaiming Our Future, and it's being held in the Chicago Embassy Suites O'Hare, which is in Rosemont, Illinois, June 2nd through 4th, Friday through Sunday, and we're asking people to come and join us to help create this plan of action or strategy for taking the country back. We have 6 keynote speakers. We have over 40 or 50 hours of presentations in an education and a strategy track. And we plan on coming out of this conference with a strategy that will be developed by the people who come and join us. We're asking them to come to Chicago, join us at the conference, and help us take the country back with your input. You can help draft this plan and put it into action, because I think it's time for us to find common ground and to stop being played for fools who are continuously pointed against each other, where we can find our power is finding common ground, coming together, and saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We're going to hold our elected officials accountable. We want to open an independent investigation, and we want justice for the American people and for the family members.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. Appreciate you being on the program. Get some sleep. I know you've been up taking interviews all day long.
Thank you very much, George. Right. I really appreciate it.
All right, that's Mike Berger. He's with an organization called 911truth.org, and I really believe that both the conspiracy people and those people who simply believe the version that we've all been told, I think there's a meshing there. I think the real truth is somewhere in the middle. I really do. Open lines, just you, just me. West of the Rockies, 800-618-8255. East of the Rockies, 800-825-5033. First-time caller line is 818-501-4721 of the wild card line. Ready to roll at 818-501-4109. Well, are you interested in chemtrails, string theory, parallel universes? What about multiple dimensions? Well, you can read all about it in the June issue of the After Dark newsletter. It's the monthly magazine made especially for you. And if you don't believe everything you hear at night, well, every month the After Dark newsletter arrives right there in your mailbox in living color to let you know that you're not dreaming. And also, we'd like to throw in a complimentary double CD, the After Dark CD, bumper music, ghost stories, and some incredible phone calls to the program as our way of saying thanks for subscribing to After Dark. Limited number of those, so here's the phone number, 1-800-727-5505. That's 1-888-727-5505. Or you can subscribe online by going to the coasttocoastam.com website. And welcome back to Coast. I'm George Norrie. Open lines for you this hour. The next hour, Canadian researcher and filmmaker Paul Kimball joins us as we're going to talk about some real strange UFO reports that haven't really gotten the kind of attention they should. I'm going to talk with Paul as well about some older UFO cases as well. He's doing a film on UFOs, and he will shed some interesting light on this subject. Paul was a very brief guest of ours when Linda Moulton Howe was at a conference in Las Vegas a couple of years ago, and we've brought him back for a full show. Let's go to the phones. Wildcard line. Welcome to Coast. You're on the air with us. Hi there.
Oh, hello, George. This is Lance from Nebraska, and this is a random thought about John Teeter. Could with President Bush sending National Guard to the border, could this be like could this start the Civil War that John Teeter was talking about?
Well, I thought of that, and a lot of people have thought of that. John Teeter, of course, being the alleged time traveler.
Oh, yes.
And who knows? One of the things that Teeter did say was that the United States would experience another civil war.
Right.
And, if tensions continue with this illegal immigration situation, you just never know.
Oh, I don't know about you, but it sure keeps me up at night. It's just, it's wild,
Don't stay up too late at night unless you're listening to the show.
Well, I work second shift, so, I customary stay up late, so...
Okay, I appreciate you being part of the program. Next up, east of the Rockies, you're on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Hey, George.
Yeah, hi.
This is Dallas from Oklahoma. How you doing?
Good, Dallas. Thank you.
George, I was calling in to, you mentioned earlier that the bird flu may have mutated.
Well, that's what the World Health Organization is looking into with a family in Indonesia. I am still going to take the position, as the several strong guests have on this program, that the bird flu will not turn into a pandemic.
Okay, what I wanted to point out, George, is that, the world is starting to look eerily similar to Stephen King's novel, The Stand. I mean, you remember how at the beginning of that they were saying the arrival of the Dark Man, and this guy was ringing a bell and stuff and saying the Dark Man was coming before the disease hit.
Yeah. Well,
that's happening now because of the 666 date that's coming up. There's some groups that are saying that the Antichrist and the Iranian president is calling the Mahdi, said the Mahdi may show or something like that. It's just getting eerily similar to that novel, so I hope that Stephen King didn't write it as prophetic.
Let's hope that. These are really strange times for all of us. I mean, I'm glad I'm alive at this era. I saw the moon landing. I was 13 years old when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. In my lifetime, and I don't know about you, Dallas, but I have gone through some incredible things as an eyewitness to history, and I think I've only seen just a little bit of some of the things that are going to happen on this planet.
I've only been here 30 years, but I've seen a lot too,
I think our biggest concern that a lot of people just aren't talking about is if we ever get hit by an asteroid. I think that has got more reality to it than anything we've talked about.
Right. Sure does.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Appreciate you being on the program. Next up, let's go to our West of the Rockies line. You're on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Hello.
Hello.
This is Karen from Sacramento.
Listening at KSTE.
Yes, from the low valley, not the high desert.
The low valley. Let's hope the low valley never gets flooded, huh?
Well, if the levees break, they will.
Oh, no, don't even say that.
No, we don't want that.
Go knock on wood sometime.
Yeah, my head. Anyway, I was wondering what you thought about the two announcements that I heard today. And the first one was that Iran launched a missile.
Some cruise missiles.
Yes.
They're doing
and
more
also,
testing.
Yeah, that the United States said that the president was trying to get Europe to put up some anti-ballistic missiles headed or aimed at Iran to keep Iran in tow. Both of these things were announced in the same day. Are they trying to say that something is going to happen pretty soon?
I think there's a very strong possibility that things could get out of control. First of all, we don't need anti-ballistic missiles to point at Iran. We've got them pointed there already.
Oh.
Our submarines, which have really been the true deterrent of nuclear war, have the capability of hitting Moscow, Beijing, Tehran within minutes.
Oh.
And we have submarines off the coasts and in the oceans.
Then why would he try to spend money to build more missiles? I don't understand.
You know what? It's a game that our leaders are playing with other leaders. I mean, I'm not going to doubt that the Iranian situation isn't a potentially dangerous one. Frankly, that's the one we should have looked at first before Iraq. But now we're in this mess, and we've got to figure out what to do with it. I really think Israel's going to do something before anybody does anything.
Well, there's a couple other things. Another thing today, they said that the president was said that if Israel got in trouble, that we would back them up.
We have to. We have no choice there.
Well, I know, but he announced it officially, which is kind of unusual. And then the other thing was those cruise missiles that they sent off in Iran, the one that they were practicing with, can hit the United States. I couldn't believe that. We're too far away, aren't we?
Well, you know what they say it could hit? I don't think it can. I think we are too far away for the Iranian missiles.
Something's going on, huh?
Yeah, it is. It's positioning, first of all. It's strategy. But more importantly, we live in some very tense times right now. And I hope people understand that. I know it. But you know what? We're not alone. We're always in it together.
Okay. Thanks, George.
Okay.
Have a good night.
You too. Sometimes all of us in our own lives get very concerned about events that are happening. I've heard little children cry because they're afraid of things that they hear on the news. And, it's difficult to comfort them. But everybody needs to understand that, we're not little islands to ourselves, as much as some of us would like to be. We're all in this thing together. I mean, and whatever happens. You deal with it. You move on because, that's part of living. And it's happened on this planet since the beginning of humankind. And they always have had catastrophes, and many of them man-made and man-created. We're going to create more. But you know what? I will take this positive attitude with me for as long as I can, no matter what we will face. And we'll face some pretty rough times together. Wildcard line, you're up. Thanks for holding. Hi there.
Hi.
Yeah, where are you?
Oh, hey, George.
I surprised you, didn't I?
Yes, you certainly did. Your voice sounds so different tonight. I've spoken with you a few times before, and it's great to speak with you again. And, George, thank you for covering the most important issues of our times and what you'll do in the future for that, I'm sure. I really do appreciate it. We all do.
Well,
and, George, I wanted to mention to you that when you had Eric Huffschmidt on about 4 months ago, I think it was.
Yes.
That I saw his video that he put out called Troubling Questions within a year before his appearance on your program. And in this video, which is you're well aware, centers around the Pentagon strike on 9/11, that he shows a picture, a photograph on a runway sits a Global Hawk flying missile. And it has very distinctive, heat-resistant, aerodynamically designed wheels that the tires are mounted onto. And I noticed this. And then in the very next thing that he goes to, and I wish you'd take a look at this, they go inside the Pentagon hole, and inside the Pentagon hole they're shining a light, and that same wheel, and it's a small wheel, it's nothing off of a large passenger airplane, is sitting right there leaning at about a 45-degree angle on the right-hand side of the picture, right on the ground.
Oh, no, you're right about that. And let me mention that Eric Huffschmidt, that interview that we had. Eric is a great writer, and his video is also fantastic. He had a difficult time conveying his thoughts on the radio, and we roughed him up a little bit that night. And then he, went into a tangent on whether we went to the moon or not, which really got me going. And I brought Richard C. Hoagland in to try to settle the matter. And it seemed like we ganged up on Eric that night. We really didn't intend to. He's a good person, and again, as I said, a great researcher. But he had a difficult time trying to convey his thoughts on the radio. I think Eric would be great in a roundtable discussion on 9/11, for example, with other people who could help back him up with some of his thoughts. A lot of times we have turned down guests on the program who have had great stories, great books, great research, but they can't convey it. And, we really, and our producers, do a great job trying to get the people who can carry on, a lengthy conversation. And Eric had a rough time that night, for those of you who are Eric fans. East of the Rockies, you're on Coast to Coast. Hi there.
Hi, George. It's Barry in Springfield, Missouri.
Hi.
I was going to tell you about a friend of mine. His brother-in-law, he lives up in St. Charles near you there.
Oh, yeah.
And he was, back in the winter, but before the first of the year, he was cutting a big tree down. And when he cut this large tree and it fell, he didn't see above him the tree he was standing under had a big deadfall, and it fell on him and crushed him.
Oh.
Hit him in the head. They say it literally drove him straight down into the ground up to his mid-shins.
Oh, my God.
And he had skull fracture, numerous spinal fractures from the C-spine down through his lumbar. And he was in the hospital in a coma for over 6 days before he ever regained any consciousness. And
he's lucky he was alive.
Lucky. Yeah, definitely lucky. Initially,
boy, you got a real bad phone line there. I wonder if you could wrap this up, because it sounds like a great story.
Okay. Well, he was in a coma, and when he came out of it, they said he'll probably never walk again. He'll be severely injured forever. But he's made a remarkable recovery. And last weekend, when my friend went to see him, he said that when he first got hit, he saw a man with the skin on his skull brown and grizzled down like right over a skull, and with long white hair and glowing red eyes. And he reached out to him and told him, "You're dead."
Oh, my God.
And he said, "I knew he was the devil, so I wouldn't go to him." And after he didn't go with the devil, he said he spent the next 6 days with Jesus building an ox cart, and that Jesus told him that he would be okay and that he would recover and to tell his story, but that he could not profit from it.
Well, I tell you what I would love for you to do, if you would. Just email us, me especially, George at coasttocoastam.com, and give me some information. And if he's at a point where he can start to talk again and can stay up late, I wouldn't mind getting him on to talk about that entire episode. Can you imagine a chunk of a tree falling on you, driving you down into the ground, and you're still alive to talk about it? That's incredible. Yeah, do that. Your hum on your phone was really starting to get bad. First time caller line, you're on Coast to Coast. Welcome to the show. Hi there.
Hi, George. First of all, I want to say you are a man full of information, intelligence. It is not a night I don't think I listened to you. Actually, I shifted to the night shift just to listen to your radio show.
That's devotion.
Yeah, my girlfriend doesn't like that too much. But,
it is difficult. I mean, this is a different kind of shift for all of us.
I have a fantastic dream to tell you, and I mean, this is a dream I had 20 years ago, but to this day, when I tell people, they're amazed. What happened was, I'm from Staten Island, New York, and I was being chased in the car by another car driver who was out for some reason to kill me.
Now, this is in the dream, or did this really happen to you?
No, sometimes in New York that could happen, but no, this
exactly.
is in the dream.
All right.
You never know in New York. Well, anyway, I'm racing all over Staten Island, and finally I get onto a campus, a school campus. It must have been summer because there was nobody there, and I'm racing through the campus, and I lost him through dodging through, buildings, around buildings. I didn't know where he was. I found a dormitory. I jumped out of the car. I went in the dormitory, went up to the 7th floor. It was a 7th floor building. I went onto the roof to try to locate where he was. Next thing I know, I hear the roof door open. And who's standing there? Man in a black suit with a gun. Couldn't see his face, though. All I knew is he was standing there with a gun. I looked at him and looked over the edge and says, I have a choice. Either I'm going to get shot and be dead, or I have a choice to jump and land 7 floors down onto grass and bushes and have a chance to live. So I took the choice to jump. You know how I woke up?
How'd you wake up?
I woke up in mid-flight, whether I jumped off the bed or I rolled off the bed, and I landed on the rug, and I screamed out, oh, my God. I was rubbing my hands into the rug. I'm saying, oh, my God. I jumped 7 floors and I'm alive. And I lifted my head, and what am I staring at? My night table.
I love it.
It was an unbelievable dream, a dream I'll never forget. Some dreams you forget within 10 minutes after you're up. This I'll never forget.
I love it. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care, George. Thank you for all the good shows.
Okay, that is a neat story. Let's go. Time for one or two more. You're on the air with us, Wildcard caller. Hi there.
Alrighty. Hey, this is Michael, Lincoln, Nebraska. George, awesome job. On behalf of my person and again and again and again, all your listeners, years and years and years. It's been awesome. I've never got to call before, but my question, I think, would be, what's your item of most concern?
Well, I guess twofold. One is deception. I can't stand it when leaders do not tell us the truth for whatever their own personal agenda is. We know what's happened in the past. We know what's going to happen in the future. That bothers me because what I see happening now seems to be an acceleration of this agenda. That concerns me, and I'm also concerned about a world war. I'm concerned about a world war that includes nuclear weapons that would bring in Russia and China, and I'm concerned about my kids, and I'm concerned about my grandchildren. I want them to have a great life. I want them to have a safe life, but I don't want them to have it under this kind of tension. And that, I think, is our biggest issue. Now, as I've said before, we're in it together. Whatever happens, happens. We'll move ahead. Whether, I'm broadcasting out of a tin can to 15 people because, every power thing has been blown up. Who knows? But that bothers me more than anything. How about you?
Yeah, well, I'm right in step with you. In fact, I've been doing some reading and studying. There's a guest I would suggest in light of what you just said, a man, Yisrael Hawkins. He's actually got a huge study on prophecy over numerous years. He's a heck of a historian. He's got some books out, and he's
all right. Would you promise to send me some information on that? You've got my
George,
email address?
I'm writing down George at Coast to Coast right down in my notebook, and
okay. And make sure you put the AM at the end. coasttocoastam.com.
Coast to Coast AM.com.
That's right, George.
Alrighty. I have another little nifty site that I ran across, a gift type thing for your listeners, if you'd permit it or not.
I can't do that, only because they hold it. But give it to Tom, and then we'll take a look at it. And if there's anything worthwhile, hey, you never know. My gosh, this hour's going on. I've got to tell you, these hours in this show seems to be going by faster and faster and faster. And speaking of speed, some of us are saying, well, all right, when is Art going to be back on? Not this weekend, for sure. I'll tell you what the weekend schedule is a little bit later on once we put that together. Because we've been working, some people are saying, George, you post the week stuff on the website, but you don't put the weekend stuff up right away. That's because we don't know either. So we try to hold back as long as we can until we realize what the situation is with Mr. Bell before we go ahead with Plan B, which we're always working on. We've always got a backup here at Coast to Coast AM. But he is not going to be on this weekend. Don't count on that. And then hopefully next week and the weekend in June, our special guest tonight, Paul Kimball. If you have a computer, get up to the coasttocoastam.com website, take a look at the feature article, and see what one of Paul's entries is. This is neat. This is an account of a very strange meteorological occurrence that took place in Venezuela in 1886, in which a family of 9 was made ill by a very vivid, dazzling light. It's a great story. That's just one of the things we'll talk about in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Well, Paul Kimball, he's the founder of Red Star Films Limited and a member of the Nova Scotia Barristers Society, the Nova Scotia Film Advisory Committee, and the Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. Since 2001, Paul has established a reputation of one of Canada's leading UFO researchers, and both through his work as an award-winning documentary filmmaker and as a researcher, writer, speaker. He has appeared on television, radio, in person at conferences, symposiums to discuss the UFO phenomenon, currently in post-production for the documentary Fields of Fear about the Canadian animal mutilation phenomena, due for release in the late summer of 2006. It was on Coast to Coast. What was it, sometime around 2004 or so, Paul, with Linda Moulton Howe for a bit?
That's right, George. It was during the second crash retrieval concert that Bob and Ryan Wood put on in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Well, it is great to get you back on. We tried to get Paul Hellyer on for just a little bit tonight with you, but he could not. He's getting up there in age, and I guess he's not feeling too well tonight, as a matter of fact. But what do you think of his story? Former Canadian defense minister basically saying, that we're in a battle with extraterrestrials.
I think I've been a frequent and well-known critic of Paul Hellyer's sort of disclosure story. I think there's a number of problems with it, not the least of which is Mr. Hellyer himself, who is most Canadians who remember Mr. Hellyer, which is an ever-dwindling number, unfortunately. His primary political time was in the mid to late 1960s and into the early to mid-1970s, so even before my generation. Had a bit of a mercurial career, a fellow who bounced around the political spectrum in Canada from center to right to left and all points in between. And most notoriously, I think most Canadians probably best remember him as the guy who unified the Canadian Armed Forces. I come from Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is Canada's major East Coast naval base, has been for hundreds of years. And he's not fondly remembered there. He's the guy who put all the sailors in green uniforms.
I remember that.
And all the airmen in green uniforms, too. So he's an interesting fellow. He was certainly, in his prime, he was one of Canada's bright, rising young political stars in the 50s and 60s. And then his career basically took a nosedive right down through the floor in the late 1960s when he resigned from Pierre Trudeau's cabinet and switched over to the Conservative Party. Now, in terms of his UFO thing, though, the problem for me, and I think with a lot of UFO researchers, is that Mr. Hellyer bases his claim that UFOs are alien vehicles come here to Earth not on anything he knew or heard or saw when he was Minister of Defense up in Canada. If that had been the case, that would be something indeed and something worth looking at. However, he bases it instead on Philip Corso's discredited book, The Day After Roswell, which I think you'd have a hard time finding any serious UFO researcher who takes that book seriously. So the problem with the Minister of Defense, former Minister of Defense Hellyer, is his own somewhat checkered career causes credibility problems up in Canada, at least, which I don't think most Americans are aware of. I think they just hear former Minister of National Defense and they go, oh, well, that's impressive. I think if you ask most Americans right now, well, if Donald Rumsfeld was to come out in 5 years as the former Secretary of Defense, would he be a particularly credible person to listen to, they might have a different answer. So in that sense, I think Americans aren't particularly aware of Mr. Hellier's somewhat credibility problems in Canada. But most importantly, in the UFO field, I think it's because he bases his claims not on what he knew personally, but on what he read in Phil Corso's book.
And you are correct, too. As a matter of fact, I was I've got to get you and Bill Burns together. Bill Burns is a co-author with me on a book that's coming out in September. And as you know, Bill co-wrote the book The Day After Roswell with Corso.
That's right.
I'd love to put you two in a room to talk about this, but you're correct. Bill was telling me about Hellier just this weekend, and he said, George, he based everything on the book, not on his own personal observations as defense minister.
Absolutely, and I was talking to a number of people who were at the Toronto Exopolitics Symposium back in September when Mr. Hellier first came forward and made his claims. And a number of them said to me they were sitting in the audience, interested to hear what Hellier had to say, and as soon as the words Day After Roswell and Philip Corso came out of his mouth, they started slinking down into their chairs. Because they knew that if what they were expecting what they were hoping, I suppose, that he would say, yes, I saw documents when I was Minister of Defense.
Yes.
Didn't come out. In fact, Mr. Hellier went to great pains to say he didn't really see anything when he was the Minister of Defense. In fact, yes, there was some investigation of some UFO claims, but he didn't find it terribly interesting, which you can believe or not believe, but if there was a serious investigation going on into UFOs, I would find that interesting. I think most people would. And he says, look, I didn't really see anything. And his only defense to that is to say, well, of course, our American cousins to the south, wouldn't brief the Canadian Minister of National Defense on anything that important. And needless to say, I find that stretches credibility. Not the least of reasons, because the Royal Canadian Air Force, for many years in the 1950s and 1960s, was the agency in Canada that was investigating UFO reports and directing UFO reporting using the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and other agencies to help them gather information. So that was within Paul Hellier's ambit of responsibility. He was directly in charge of the Air Force in Canada when he was Minister of Defense. I find it very hard to believe that he didn't see some interesting things cross his desk. So, that's what I make of Mr. Hellier. To me, it's a non-story. The only thing about Mr. Hellier that's a story is that people within ufology have made it a story, which I guess is the story. But what he's saying isn't really much of a story.
Had we gotten him on tonight, it would have been the fact that, and I would have asked him, I would have said, Mr. Hellier, you picked up a book called The Day After Roswell, you read it, and now you're a believer in this extraterrestrial battle, but why didn't you see anything as the defense minister?
That would be a question that I would ask him, and what I would say to people who bring Mr. Hellier around is Paul Hellier's testimony is worth no more, nor no less, than anybody else who might have read Philip Corso's book and comes out and says, look, I believe that Corso was
or any other book. I mean, a U.S. astronaut could have picked up the book and said, oh, I think I believe this. But that doesn't mean that they have firsthand knowledge of what's going on here.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the fundamental mistakes that ufology makes, or at least certain segments within ufology, and what seems to be a growing segment, unfortunately, within ufology makes. They latch on to somebody like Mr. Hellier because it supports their preconceived belief system. That is that UFOs exist and that UFOs are alien spacecraft. The problem is there are so many good cases out there. I mean, so many good cases that don't get the attention they deserve, that are largely unknown, and instead of focusing in on those, and those are the kind of cases that could draw serious attention, I think, from the scientific community, the journalistic community, even the political community, if properly presented to them in a serious, rational, responsible way. Ufology, or at least a large segment of it today, tends to focus on stories like Philip Corso's and Paul Hellier's appearance on the scene. And even, Project Serpo got a fair amount of play last year and continues to get some play into the new year here in 2006.
Sure.
I think that's a fundamental mistake. I think it's a mistake that ufology made probably about 25 years ago when Roswell started. And I don't think it's a left turn or a right turn, depending on which way you want to go, off the straight and narrow that they should have stayed on. It's not a conscious decision by a large group of people. It just happened to be the way things went. And that's, That's too bad, because there's so much good stuff out there that I think your listeners and everybody else, from the president to the senators to Canadian members of parliament to the world's top scientists, would really be interested and fascinated by, just as my friends are when I explain it to them, if they could actually hear it.
Well, we're going to look forward to talking with you about some of these cases tonight, Paul.
Absolutely.
Here's a story you'll get a kick out of. When I was 21 years old, my very first radio interview in Detroit was with a fellow who came to a university to speak, and we've remained friends, Stanton Friedman, who I have just found out is your uncle.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, he married my Aunt Marilyn about 30 years ago, I guess.
That's a small world.
It is indeed. 6 degrees of separation, or I guess in your case, in my case, 1 degree of separation.
Yet you two don't see eye to eye on everything, do you?
No, that's true. And, I always preface my remarks to that effect by saying I have nothing but the greatest respect for Stan and everything he's done over the years, and an immense fondness for him. He was a hoot at family reunions. He still is. In fact, he's not a blood relative, but he knows more about my family than anybody else in my family seems to. So he was a great guy to have around and a really cool uncle, and he still is. And he and Marilyn, his wife, are running the Kimball family reunion this year. And they always put on a good show up in Fredericton. But you're right, we don't see eye to eye on everything. Certainly not on Majestic 12. Probably not on Roswell, although I continue to sit on the fence on that one. Not on Wilbert Smith, and not on the overall concept of a cosmic Watergate, or what Kevin Randall would call the conspiracy of silence. Those are things that we disagree on, and sometimes quite vehemently. Stan took me to task in the MUFON Journal back in May, I guess, for some comments I made about MJ-12 and Wilbert Smith, quite forcefully, and I responded on my blog equally forcefully. But the nice thing is, and this is the way it should be, Stan and I can, as soon as something like that comes out, call each other or meet each other and go, hey, no hard feelings, how's it going, and
sure,
politely move along. And I think that's something else that ufology sometimes is missing. Sometimes it gets terribly personal. I guess every field of endeavor does. But Stan and I, remain the good chums and all that sort of stuff.
You are definitely not a debunker, especially with the work you've been doing and this film that's coming out, Fields of Fear. But you would be considered a skeptic in that you don't believe as quickly as some other people do various UFO stories and cases.
Absolutely. In fact, I think the two most misunderstood terms are debunker and skeptic.
Yes.
I am a debunker if it's bunk. Bunk should be debunked. So I view Philip Corso's book as bunk. It should be debunked. I'm looking at a copy of the Skeptical Inquirer, a sometimes much loathed magazine by
That's Michael Shermer's, right?
Yep.
Yeah, he's
and
been on
it's
before.
from March and April of 1998, and in there is a review of Phil Corso's The Day After Roswell. The review is written by Brad Sparks, a longtime UFO researcher, probably one of the 5 brightest, most knowledgeable researchers in ufology over the last 20 or 30 years. I just interviewed him earlier tonight for our new film, Best Evidence. We're out here in California. And he rips Philip Corso's book a new one, as they say, and that makes him a debunker. Michael Salas called him a debunker. This is the hilarious thing. Michael Salas called Brad Sparks, Kevin Randall, and Stan Friedman debunkers because they went after Philip Corso and some of Exopolitics' other whistleblowers, in quotation marks. I think if somebody's spewing bunk, they should be debunked, and then you don't have to deal with them anymore. I think everybody should be skeptical. I think that's the only way, really, to go about it, to look at each claim as it comes in, or each case as it comes in.
It's healthy to be a skeptic, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think so. I quite frankly, I think it's the only way you can be. It's, in many respects, and I might upset some of my evangelical relatives here, but, I consider myself an agnostic with high hopes that it's all real. And the same thing's generally true of UFOs. And I don't see how you can be otherwise, because for me, whether it's religion or UFOs, there is not enough evidence to base a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt, which in both cases is what I would need, because they're tremendously extraordinary claims. But there is enough evidence, certainly with UFOs, to make me very interested, and to keep me interested, and to look at all the varying theories, too. I think ufology for too long, especially in the United States, not so much in the United Kingdom or in other countries, has been fixated on the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or what some have come to see as the extraterrestrial fact. And I guess that's the most fundamental difference between Stan and I. Stan views it as the ETF, the extraterrestrial fact. He believes that extraterrestrials or flying saucers have visited Earth, they're still here, probably interacting with humanity in some respect or another. I view it as it's the ETH to me. It's the extraterrestrial hypothesis. It's a very valid, good working hypothesis. There are other very valid, good working hypotheses. Reasonable people can disagree over which one might be more valid, but I don't think you can say that any one has been proved, at least not to my satisfaction. And I don't think if you took the sort of stereotypical 12 reasonable people off the street and presented all the evidence to them, that they would say that it's been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. But beyond a balance of probabilities, 50% plus one, a civil trial standard, well, that might be a different thing.
What do you think of this latest British report that says 30 years of investigating shows that there's nothing to it?
Yeah, the Condon Report, a name that was supposedly generated at random, which is amusing in and of itself. I think this is a very good example of how ufology sometimes misses the forest while it's bashing into the trees. As soon as this was mentioned, the four guys who dug the report out in the United Kingdom, Dave Clark, Andy Roberts, Greg or Gary Anthony, I can never remember which, I think it's Gary, and Joe McGonigal, sort of have a very love-hate relationship, shall we say, with American ufology. So they had nothing to do with the report other than to bring it forward. They were the guys who got it released.
Under their Freedom of Information Act.
Exactly.
Guess, right? Okay.
But the initial response from a lot of people on this side of the pond, as it were, was negative, largely because it seemed to be coming from those guys. And plasma was mentioned as sort of the main reason behind UFOs, and the American ufologists tended to jump on that without even reading the full report, I might add. Plasma, bad, evil, we've heard it all before, blah, blah, blah. And this is one of the biggest problems ufology has is PR, basic public relations problems. Because here's what they should have done, and what I did at my blog. You should ignore that. Forget about the conclusion. It's not important. What you should say is a major Western government, the second most powerful, unless the French have been updating their capabilities lately, the second most powerful military power in the Western world, America's closest ally, one of the big five, as it were, still on the UN Security Council with veto power, has actually, their Ministry of Defense considered UFOs, or UAP as they call them, serious enough to warrant sort of a long-term study. And forget their conclusions. The report says UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon, exist. They're real. Then the guy says, who wrote the report, well, I think it's this. So what? The important thing is they admit that it's real. To me, that's what ufology should have latched on and said, here's a major Western government saying it's real.
You've got a good news sense about you, Paul, because you're able to look at a story and pick out the lead in it, as we used to do in our days, that modern-day ufologists, who really aren't journalists, can't do.
Yeah, well, it's all about framing, and some people think this is a pejorative sort of way of looking at it, but it's all about framing the message. There's good and bad in everything. The point should be to stress the good and, underplay the stuff that you don't agree with, and in this particular case that didn't make any sense, because people will come out without you yelling and looking sort of somewhat ridiculous. Scientists quickly came out afterwards and said, well, this doesn't make very much sense. Plasma might explain a few UFO sightings, but doesn't really explain this one and this one and this one and this one. And so other people can do that work for you. But what you should be stressing as ufologists is, here's the good stuff. Major Western government saying it's real. Now, they don't say what it is, but they say it's worth study. Obviously, they think it's worth study because
that is dramatic, Paul.
Absolutely. Big story. And it was a story that was largely missed. And I think if ufologists, if their initial reaction had been that, they could have turned the story around and framed it in a different way, and I think that would have been a positive. You put that one in the win column, and instead it was sort of a neutral, or perhaps you might even put it in the loss column. And I think that's a missed opportunity. But that's the history of ufology in the last 25 or 30 years, missed opportunities.
Hey, Paul, when we come back, let's talk a little bit about how you got interested in this, because I understand that you're trained as a lawyer, and then we'll get into some of these specific cases that a lot of us should hear about, because we don't hear about them from other sources. We'll be back in a moment. Paul Kimball, our guest on Coast to Coast AM. And our special guest tonight is Paul Kimball. He's a founder of Red Star Films. We're going to talk with him about UFOs in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. Paul, can you tell us, how did you become interested in UFOs? I mean, you've got a very varied background here.
Well, having Stan Friedman at your family reunions is always a good start. That's pretty much guaranteed. I don't know. There's no defining moment, George. I've never seen one. I hadn't really read a lot of books when I was in high school about it. My dad had some books around. Mostly stuff, like Chariots of the Gods and things by Eric von Daniken, and some of Stan's books and some other stuff. I don't know. I must have just read a book somewhere or fallen into it. But Stan probably gets most of the credit because he was always talking, and I always found him an interesting guy. And I found the subject interesting too because it was something that I had an interest in history. My undergraduate degree's in history, and my graduate studies were in history. So that. There's a lot of history in the UFO field, but the legal training as well. And my dad was a criminal court judge for 25 years, give or take. So I grew up in a household where things like evidence and standards of proof were important, and I carried that through into law school. So, all of those factors probably came into play, and I find it's a fascinating field because you've got a lot of cases with a lot of quality, reliable witnesses, but you don't have any hard evidence. And any lawyer will tell you that you'd always like to have the smoking gun, so to speak. But any lawyer will also tell you that it's a challenge and it can be a lot of fun to try and make a case based on circumstantial evidence because it forces you to think and it forces you maybe to work a little harder than you'd have to work if you literally had the smoking gun.
Give us your overall impression, your theory, your belief system, if you would, Paul, about this UFO phenomenon. And that'll allow us, I think, really to get into some of these stories that you're going to tell us about.
No comment. No, sorry. Just kidding.
And UFOs, so we've got 3 more hours to fill after that, right?
UFOs are real, George. I prefer the term UAP, unidentified aerial phenomenon. I think UFO as a term is incorrect because the words flying object imply something that is definitive, basically an alien spacecraft as far as I'm concerned.
You're right.
I think that's a possibility, absolutely, and I'm not afraid to say that on radio or television or wherever else I go. I also think there are other possibilities, and I don't think we know which one of those possibilities is correct. In fact, I was interviewing Mac Tonys in Kansas City, and then he was out traveling with us here in California for a couple of days, just left today. And Mac made a very good point, and I quite agree with it, that these theories, which so many people think of as perhaps mutually exclusive, well, if it's aliens, it can't be extra-dimensional beings. And if it's extra-dimensional beings, it can't be time travelers, and et cetera, are not necessarily all mutually exclusive. 2 of them could be correct, 3 of them could be correct, or frankly, none of them could be correct. And it may be really, we could all explain it as natural phenomena, misidentifications, and other things, perhaps that we don't even know about our own planet and what might be going on in the sky. So I come at it from the view that UAP, is a real objective phenomenon that's worthy of serious scientific, historical, journalistic study. What it is, I don't know. But I think people should take it seriously and should look at it seriously, and I think that's the way forward.
But you, like I believe, whatever it is, because I don't know either, it is definitely happening. How, where, who knows? But there are just too many real episodes of strangeness by people who I feel to be pretty legitimate people, and you just can't sweep it under the carpet.
Absolutely. I fully agree. The only caveat that I would add on that is I don't necessarily believe that there's a paranormal explanation. I believe that that's one possibility, and there are many different ways that you can cut the paranormal cake, if you will, extra-dimensional, time travel, all that sort of stuff. And perhaps, if time travel is the answer, it's not paranormal. It's paranormal to us, but it's not paranormal 5,000 years from now.
Well, and you're right, and it could very well be a natural explanation.
Yeah, the truth is, if somebody from the 17th century was 17th century, forget that. If somebody from the 1970s, if me as a kid was to wander into a classroom today, I'd view most of the things that I saw there as paranormal. iPods, computers, the advances we've made in technology in the last 10 years, much less the last 20 and 30, even the last 5, are astounding. When I began my music career in the early 1990s after law school, cassette was it. CDs were just starting to come on the market. Now, I don't know what happened to the CD era, but now everybody's got an iPod. I don't even know, really know what an iPod is.
Well, and you know what? People are downloading their own CDs now. I'm amazed that some of these record stores are still in business.
Absolutely. Although there's probably always a niche.
I should say CD stores. They don't even have records anymore.
I know, although there's probably always a niche market for it for Luddites like me. But I see people walking around with what I call Borg phones, the ones that sort of fit over their ears and almost look like they've been implanted. And maybe that's only 5 years away where you'll actually have it implanted into your body. And in a world of that kind of rapid technological change where the curve seems to be going so far upward so fast that it's almost bending backwards, the very definition of what's paranormal and what's normal is becoming something that's very hard to sort of get a grasp on. So the things that we see in the sky, the things that credible witnesses have seen in the sky, we might view them as paranormal, but we might not be viewing them as paranormal for very much longer.
You had mentioned when we were talking about Stanton Friedman, MJ-12, which we all listening to Coast and being part of it understand what it is, and that is that organization that purportedly was set up during the Truman era to investigate UFOs. We know about Stan's views on the cosmic Watergate, but you mentioned Wilbert Smith, and I'm not very familiar with him. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Wilbert Smith is one of the icons, I suppose, of early ufology. He was a Canadian civil servant in the 1950s, had been for in the 30s and 40s, who supposedly had a meeting with an American scientist named Robert Sarbacher in 1950 while he was down in Washington. Interestingly, Smith was in Washington. He basically cut class. He was in Washington for a radio and broadcast conference, but he had a pre-existing interest in UFOs, so he sought out, as the story goes, through the Canadian Embassy, anybody who would talk to him from the American government or even remotely affiliated with the American government about UFOs. And he wound up with Robert Sarbacher. And Smith came back from that meeting and wrote a memo, which was declassified or discovered in the 1970s, I believe. I think Stan told me by somebody mysteriously named Mr. X. He had his name legally changed to Mr. X, so it was something else before that. Smith, in the memo, which was titled Geomagnetics and was primarily concerned with the study of geomagnetics, stated that Sarbacher told him a number of things about UFOs. One, that it was classified 2 points higher than the H-bomb. 2, that they exist. 3, that the details contained in Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers, were essentially correct. There was a top-secret project in the United States being headed by Vannevar Bush, Dr. Vannevar Bush, whose purpose was to discover the modus operandi of UFOs, flying saucers.
Was he related at all to the current Bushes?
No, Van Bush wasn't, no.
Okay.
Not that I know of, certainly not closely, maybe 18th cousin
Maybe a distant, okay.
Yeah, but no, I don't think so. Vannevar Bush was America's science czar in the Second World War, an incredibly bright man. But that's one of the fundamental problems with the Wilbert Smith story, and one of the fundamental problems with the MJ-12 documents, which cite Bush as one of the key figures in MJ-12. By the time the Roswell crash supposedly happened, by the time Wilbert Smith was supposedly told that Vannevar Bush in 1950 was heading up this top-secret organization, and by the time the MJ-12 documents identify him as one of the key figures in MJ-12, Vannevar Bush was so far out of the loop in Washington, he was in Baltimore, effectively speaking, and perhaps even New York. I mean, he was out there. He was Roosevelt's guy, and this is something that ufologists, including Stan, have chosen to ignore. He was Roosevelt's man, and as soon as Truman came in, he was more of a Roosevelt kind of guy, too, an urbane, sophisticated, intellectual. He was not a Harry Truman kind of backroom politicking guy. And Truman and Bush did not get along. I have a number of columns on my blog that deal with some of the research into Vannevar Bush. There's an excellent biography by Pascal Zachary called Endless Frontier. It's about Vannevar Bush's life. And by 1947-48, Bush was done. He was finished as a major force in Washington. He was not a guy that Harry Truman would have tapped to be on the most secret committee, the most secret project looking into the most highly classified, 2 points higher than the H-bomb, project in the United States. Wouldn't have happened. Couldn't have happened. All the historical evidence points otherwise. That alone, in my mind, is enough to discredit the Wilbert Smith story, and it's enough to discredit the MJ-12 documents. Now, there's many other things that discredit both, but that's a very interesting one that ufologists who support those two stories have chosen to overlook, or maybe they just don't know about. They haven't been reading my blog, I guess.
We've got on our feature article at coasttocoastam.com one of your entries of a strange story that occurred in 1886 in Venezuela. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
Well, you got me there. Who did I hear about that one? That wasn't Brad Sparks, I think, turned me on to that one.
Okay, so that's not one of yours.
No. That's one you can find on the web. There's a link on my particular article, which I guess you folks, I've been traveling for a week,
yeah.
so I don't really know what you guys have up there.
We've got an aggressive webmaster, Paul. He grabs everything he finds.
There you go, perfect. It's an interesting story. I put it up at a time when I was looking into cases pre-1947, because that's another thing ufology has done. It's chosen to focus on sort of 1947, Kenneth Arnold Roswell. That's the starting point for UFOs. And it might be for the modern era, but there's a lot of interesting stuff, which may or may not be relevant, but still very interesting, that comes before that. So I was running through a series of columns on my blog about a case in Canada in 1611, where some French missionaries saw what was probably the Aurora Borealis, but still, would have been a UFO report at the time, and you should catalog it and then say probably Aurora Borealis. Some religious figures, and trying to tie in maybe religion and UFOs, and how maybe they're seeing the same thing but just perceiving it differently. Mm-hmm. There's a very good case, a very interesting case anyway, from the Bay of Fundy up in my home province, Nova Scotia, from 1792, 1793, somewhere in the 1790s, where a young girl and two men allegedly saw something that could only be called an airship. In fact, the description that was written down in a journal at the time by a guy named Simeon Perkins, a respected merchant in Nova Scotia who had heard the story secondhand. Perkins's diary is one of the primary historical resources of that time period in Canadian history. He actually notes it in his diary and says, well, I don't necessarily put any credit to it, but here's the story that's going around. Now, it's impossible to go back and investigate that case, but you can still listen to or read what these people were allegedly, supposedly describing and say, well, does this sound like anything else? And it does bear some similarities to the Father Gill sighting in New Guinea in the 1950s here.
Oh, that was a great story, too, and you can tell us about that.
Yeah. It also bears some similarities to the airship sightings in the 1890s in the United States. Not completely, but somewhat of the same kind of similarities. The Father Gill sighting was, he was a missionary, I think it was the Church of England, but I'm not exactly sure, in New Guinea in the 1950s, and he and many of his flock saw what they claimed was a UFO and basically come flying in, and they could see it had portholes, and they could see people who were supposedly waving at them, as far as I can recall. It's a good case. I'm not sure it's a great case, but it's a very interesting case, and you would think a missionary and his flock would be fairly credible witnesses to something, to having seen something. Whether they misperceive something or not, I don't know. It's not one that I've looked at more than superficially, but guys like Jerry Clark, for instance, could natter on for an hour about the Father Gill case. And his UFO encyclopedia contains all of these things, or most of them, and it's a wonderful resource that if you're truly serious in the subject, you should probably have sitting on your bookshelf somewhere.
What year did the dirigibles come out? I don't remember that. But it must. Do you think it was after the period that these people were seeing these kinds of airships?
I'm not an expert on that particular subject, but my understanding from talking to people who are is that they were coming at it about the same time. That the dirigibles, the Zeppelins, whatever you want to call them, were being developed in the late 19th century, or at least being thought of. So I talked to a couple of people who said that they believed they were secret, that people actually did see some things. Some of them were hoaxes, but some people actually saw some things. And they were top secret it's kind of like saying the flying triangles are American government experiments now.
Exactly.
The airship stories of the late 19th centuries may have been top secret American government experiments then too. I don't know. Not my area of expertise. Just something that I sort of look into in passing, as it were.
I mean, they may have been seeing prototypes all over the place.
Could be. I'm always kind of loath to comment on things that I don't know very well, but it's worth looking into. And that my entire point with the Venezuelan case, but also with looking back into the sightings in Nuremberg with the wood carvings from 1553, I think, or 1563, somewhere in there anyway, in the mid 1500s. That's referenced in Carl Jung's book. All of these things, Ezekiel's wheel, Emperor Constantine seeing the burning cross before the battle, all of this stuff is grist for the mill, and it's worth looking into. And Stan and I have had a number of conversations. Stan,
to hold our own here in our views that the bird flu will not become a pandemic. But according to the World Health Organization, they say a family of 8 people infected with the bird flu in Indonesia may have passed the disease among themselves rather than catching it from poultry. The agency did not immediately indicate whether it was going to raise its alert level, which remained at 3, where it's been for months. That means there is no very limited human-to-human transmission. They don't seem to be too concerned about that, but I wanted you to know about that story anyway. Another attack by an animal on a human. This in Orwell, Ohio. A 500-pound bear escaped from an animal breeder, entered a neighboring home, and attacked a woman. The victim was expected to survive. The bear was lured out of the house and shot to death by the breeder. But still, again, another attack by animals. The Egyptian authorities have given the go-ahead for the underwater exploration of what appears to be a Roman city submerged in the Mediterranean. Well, the old guy that we talk about all the time, Zahi Hawass, said in a statement that an excavation team that had found the ruins of the Roman city some 20 miles east of the Suez Canal on Egypt's north coast. The archaeologists had found buildings, bathrooms, ruins of a Roman fortress, ancient coins, bronze vases, and pieces of pottery that all date back to the Roman era. Egypt's Roman era, by the way, lasted from 30 BC to 337 AD. In Bucharest, Romania, more than 60 years after it was seized by communists, the Romanian government is to hand back one of the country's most popular tourist sites, the fabled Dracula Castle, to its former owner. The handover ceremony will take place Friday in the 14th century Castles Museum, deep within the fortress in Transylvania. The castle, worth an estimated $25 million, was once owned by the late Queen Marie and bequeathed to her daughter, Princess Elena, in 1938. It was confiscated by the communists in 1948 and fell into disrepair. Now, in a moment, as I mentioned, we are going to be talking with a member of the 9/11 Truth Organization about this quest here. Apparently, Americans would like to get more information. They want to get to the bottom of 9/11. We'll be back in a moment on that story on Coast to Coast AM. Mike Berger is the media coordinator for the 9/11 Truth Organization. Born and raised in New York, he earned a degree in sociology with a focus on human motivation. The 9/11 Truth Organization, as I mentioned, is a coalition of researchers, journalists, and family members working to expose and get answers to the hundreds of still unresolved questions concerning 9/11. Mike works to get to the truth of what went wrong and why we were so unprepared for the attacks. He's currently married, lives in St. Louis, my neck of the woods. Mike, I'm still in St. Louis. We should have invited you down to the cave for this interview. How are you?
Great. How are you, George?
Good. It's good to talk with you. This Zogby poll, which is estimating now that over 70 million American adults support a new 9/11 investigation, tells me that there's still a lot of unrest. After all these years, they cannot muster, those people who believe the true government position cannot even muster 50% of the people to believe the story. What does this tell you, Mike, in the organization 9/11 Truth?
Well, I think it's quite amazing, actually, if you think about the powerful machinery of the mainstream media, or as some people call them, the liberal media, in promoting the official propaganda of the government conspiracy.
From the heartland of America, the gateway to the West. Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be, across the nation, around the world. I'm George Norrie, and welcome to the world's most listened to Coast AM. Good to be with you, and thanks for the privilege of broadcasting this wonderful program for you. Open lines at the half, and next hour, Paul Kimball, UFO cases in North America. And get ready for some of the things he's going to say. Well, here's some quick stories of the day. Even though this tape, purporting to be from Osama bin Laden, has not been authenticated yet, he is saying that Zacarias Moussari had no link to the 9/11-2001 attacks. Now this, according to the al-Qaeda leader, again, but like I said, this audio tape that surfaced on a website has not been authenticated. Who knows who it may be? It could be bin Laden. Bin Laden's alleged voice claims responsibilities to carry out the attacks, that they were given by him to 19 men, and that Moussari was not one of them. The new tape is propaganda, plain and simple, says a U.S. intelligence source. The official said the message is part of bin Laden's continuing effort to demonstrate that he's a relevant extremist leader who is knowledgeable of current events. The tape is not entirely unexpected. Leading up to the Moussari verdict, the government was monitoring jihadist websites in anticipation of a response to the jury's decision. A new Zogby poll apparently reveals that less than half of the American public trusts the official 9/11 story or believes the attacks were adequately investigated. The poll is the first scientific survey of Americans' belief in a 9/11 cover-up or the need to investigate possible U.S. government complicity. In a moment, we're going to be talking with some people about this from the 9/11 Truth Organization. That's a coalition of researchers, journalists, and victim family members working to expose and get answers to this situation. So that story is upcoming in just a moment. Now, don't panic on this one because we are still going.
Conspiracy story, if they can't muster after 4.5 years more than half the country supporting the official story, it would seem to me that it demonstrates that grassroots movements in this country are and can be effective. That we no longer rely on just the mainstream media for information, of the power of the internet and new technology to communicate and get research and evaluate evidence out to people. It works. It's working, and that I think it's a really a positive, optimistic sign for our future that we can reclaim the country effectively.
Do you believe there's going to be any activity, because your organization, 9/11 Truth, would like to get these politicians or candidates to really recognize, hey, this is a major issue here, let's get some answers. But is it going to go any further than where it is now, Mike?
Absolutely. I think this poll shows that the American people, I mean, again, those who are aware of, for example, the collapse of this third building, Building 7, happens to be almost the same proportion of people in the poll who don't trust the official story and want a new independent investigation. So I think the implications are that if you're a political candidate running in 2006, there's an enormous constituency here of people who are looking for change.
Mike, so important for you to tell us about your organization, because you are not conspiracy buffs. You are a coalition of some dedicated people. Tell me about the members of the 9/11 Truth Organization.
Sure. I mean, we're a grassroots organization made up of average people, of, in some cases, researchers, journalists, artists, scholars, average people who put together and publish research on the internet, put together events like our upcoming conference in Chicago, 9/11, Revealing the Truth, Reclaiming Our Future, and are involved in public education to raise awareness about the events of 9/11, but not only 9/11, because ultimately for us to be effective as in changing the direction our country is going, we have to find common ground with other people who also see that 9/11 has been the justification for so many unfavorable policies, illegal wars. Even just last week when they released the Flight 77 video at the Pentagon,
right.
Over and over you heard this as the justification that Americans needed to be reminded why we're in Iraq, why we're in this war, and why it's okay to have Americans under surveillance.
Mike, is your organization taking a stand on that issue itself, Flight 77, that some people say never hit the Pentagon? My question to those people, whether it did or did not, I do not know, though I'd like to see the video, quite frankly, because what I've seen so far doesn't show me a plane hitting the Pentagon at all, so I have some doubts. But I want to know what happened to the plane, where it might be. Does your organization look into that?
Actually, George, our position is very similar to yours in that we support the Freedom of Information Act requests, not just by Judicial Watch, but there was actually another person, Mr. Bingham, who had filed multiple Freedom of Information Act requests. His were never acknowledged. It's interesting that the government chose to honor the Freedom of Information Act request of Judicial Watch, and yet they really didn't, because they only gave us those more ambiguous frames, as you said, which still don't prove their case. So for us, I mean, on another level, I see the Flight 77 issue as a distraction, because there